Well, as it's been said before, God is in fact bigger than the boogeyman and the monsters on TV. Stick around, let me explain. I'm terrified of bees.
You like jazz?
Well, maybe not so much anymore as I was as a kid, but as a kid growing up, I was actually deathly afraid of bees. And people would always tell me, oh, it's not those little honeybees you gotta be scared of, it's only the wasps. 8-year-old me wouldn't ask, wouldn't care. I hated bees, they just freaked me out with their wings and their stingers. I didn't like them. And when they used to come around, I'd freak out. My parents would be like, you gotta stop, you're startling them, you're making them scared. And I'd be like, I think you got that backwards. I'm the one here that's terrified. And well, I think I'm gladly able to say I finally conquered my fear of bees over the years. I've been able to take on some of the real fears in life, like student debt, dying alone, feeling like I'll never be good enough, and of course, the murder hornets from Japan, which are the angriest things to come out of the Pacific since World War II. Unless your name is Steve Irwin, at certain points in our life, we're all gonna have to face our fears. Whether it's the small thing like bees, bears, sharks, getting the ball spiked on you by Jagger and 9 Square, or the bigger fears like wondering what you're gonna do with your life, losing those who are close to you, or maybe some of the fears you felt during the pandemic. We are all gonna have to face fears in our life. And I don't know who needs to hear that, but that's okay. You're gonna face fears. Fears are a natural part of our life, and they're things we're gonna have to face. We're gonna read you guys from Isaiah 43:2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned, and the flames will not set you ablaze. When we talk about fears, this verse is interesting. One thing that's important to take out of this verse is that it doesn't say that in our life we're not going to have to face the waters. We're not going to have to face the fires. We're not going to have to face those fears. But what this verse is telling us is that when we face those waters, when we face the fires, sure, we might feel the heat. Sure, our trousers might get full, but we get to see to the other side. We get to understand that God is going to get us through it, and it requires some trusting in Him as we talk about facing our fears. Depending on where you are in life might greatly influence what kind of fears you might have to face. For a lot of you in high school, you might be facing those fears of wondering, well, what am I going to do when I graduate? Maybe you feel like you don't have a plan, or maybe you feel like you should be heading in a certain direction and you don't know what direction that is. Those kinds of fears are completely normal to have and want to face. Because when we acknowledge them and want to face them, it's the first step in deciding how much they get to influence our lives. It can sound so childish sometimes to say, oh, stand up and fight your fears. But oftentimes in our lives, when it comes to facing our fears, we so often just choose to ignore them, to try and find loopholes or go around them instead of facing them. And that isn't what God calls us to do. You never want to find yourself in life regretting not doing something or heading in a different direction because you let your fears overcome you. So many times in the Bible you hear the phrase, do not be afraid. When the Bible says do not be afraid, it's not telling you go avoid your fears at all costs, find loopholes around them, just forget about them. It means face them and trust in God to get you through them. So let me say this. If you're right now in life feeling unsure about the future, feeling like you're supposed to be doing something you're not, feeling like you're falling behind, those are fears we're gonna have to face. It's natural to have those fears and have to face them. But what we can't let those fears do is overcome our lives. And we can't let those fears draw away from the idea that God doesn't still have a plan for us. So many times in lives we try and avoid our fears like we're Justin Trudeau dodging questions at a press conference, but that isn't what God calls us to do. We can see how easy it is for us to want to dodge our fears when we read about the story of Peter. So if you don't know who Peter is, I hope you do, but he was one of Jesus' disciples. And after Jesus was crucified on the cross, Peter went into fear. At the Last Supper, just the night before, Jesus had told Peter, you're gonna deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. And Peter had always been loyal to Jesus, been one of his most trusting disciples. And he just thought it was ludicrous for Jesus to even suggest he would ever deny him. But when Jesus was crucified on the cross and being taken to death, Peter became overcome by fear. So that when Peter was asked, were you that man with Jesus? He denied Jesus not once, but all 3 times, just as Jesus had prophesied he was gonna do. Peter became overcome by fear, so he denied who Jesus was. And this story does have a turnaround because Peter eventually took a step in his faith and overcome these fears. But if Peter would have chosen to live the rest of his life in fear, he would have never been able to accomplish what God had in store for him. Peter went out amongst the nations with confidence, knowing Jesus, who he was, and he was Lord, and he spoke the word across the world. But if he would have been overcome by his fear, he never would have been able to take that step and never would have been able to fulfill what God had for him. We can't let our fear take away from what God has in store for us. It's okay to have fears, but you have to face them. As the wise poet Jim Carrey once said, fears will be a factor in your life, but you get to decide how much. If you find that fear is becoming a driving factor in your life and holding you back, I think you need to ask yourself, where is my relationship with God at? Am I not able to trust in him when I face these fears? And if the answer is no, then it sounds like you know what you need to work on. Trusting God doesn't mean we won't have to still face fears, but we get the confidence of knowing that what's on the other side. And that if we trust through God, he'll get us through the water so they won't sweep over us, and he'll get us through the fire so they won't set us ablaze. Here's my challenge to you guys for this week. Ask yourself, what am I worried about in life? What fears am I facing? And am I trusting God in them, or am I allowing them to overcome my life? That's what I want you guys to do this week.
And now it's time for Silly Songs with Larry, the part of the show where Larry comes out and sings a silly song.